Hello, everyone. My name is Franz Hartmann. I'm the coordinator of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance. Welcome. Before we get going, I would like to make a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land I am on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. These are lands that were meant to be shared with nature and in a way that honors the life that we have been given. The history of this land clearly demonstrates that we have not lived up to these intentions or promise. To have hope for future generations, to have a sustainable world for them, we must recognize the value in each other, reconcile for past tragedies, and ensure compassionate care and concern for all. Further, we must recognize that the various components of our ecosystem, the air, land, water, flora, and fauna, are all interdependent and need to work in harmony. The only way forward is together. On behalf of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance Steering Committee, including Anne Bell from Ontario Nature, Linda Lukasik from Environment Hamilton, and Kevin Thomason from the Grand River Environmental Network, who's here, I would like to welcome you to From NIMBY to YIMBY, a discussion on how to turn gentle density opponents into proponents. And again, just to ask everyone to keep the mute button on for now. For those of you not familiar with the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance, we're a network of over 100 organizations from across Ontario, but mostly in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, working together to protect Ontario and expand Ontario's world-famous Greenbelt. One of the ways we do this is by working with community leaders, including elected local officials and their staff, to find ways to use planning tools to help overcome key local challenges in a way that also helps the Greenbelt, which is why we're here today. In February and March, we held regional webinars aimed at helping local councillors, mayors, and municipal staff navigate the municipal comprehensive review process in a way that's also good for the Greenbelt. And I know that some of you participated in that. One of the recurring comments we got from participants was, we want webinars on solutions, specifically what we can do right now to make sustainable communities. We heard you loud and clear, which is why we're here today. This is the first of 3 webinars aimed specifically at solutions. You can sign on to the other 2 through our website, www.greenbeltalliance.ca. Today, our focus is turning NIMBYs into YIMBYs. And let me introduce our expert guide for today, Kevin Eby. Kevin is an urban planner with a broad range of provincial, municipal, and private sector consulting experience. Kevin was the Director of Community Planning at the Region of Waterloo from 2000 to 2015, and he was also a member of the Provincial Greenbelt Council from 2018 to 2020. Most importantly for today, Kevin has lots of firsthand experience in how to turn NIMBYs into YIMBYs. Kevin will also be joined today by another Kevin, Kevin Thomason from the Grand River Environmental Network and a member of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance. Kevin Thomason has a long history of successful community engagement in the Waterloo region and surrounding regions, which, as you will see shortly, is an important element in turning NIMBYs into YIMBYs. So Kevin is going to start with a presentation followed by a Q&A. Feel free to pop questions into the chat function at any time, and we will get to them after Kevin finishes his presentation. Now over to you, Kevin Eby.
Thank you very much, Franz. Let me say up front, anybody who's come today looking for a silver bullet that's instantly going to create wonderful things, you might as well save the next 55 minutes and log out, because it's not easy, but it's worth doing. And I think the reality is that turning the NIMBY into a YIMBY is a requirement that we all need to really strive to achieve. Yesterday, the day before, there was a great article in the New York Times that talked about it You know, the reality of NIMBYs versus YIMBYs is a major factor in housing affordability in the States. So I just want to start out with a couple examples and use them as the basis. Some of you might know in Uptown Waterloo, there's a former industrial site that used to be Canbar Industries. And it was a really key potential redevelopment site in Waterloo. It's in a wonderful location. The Waterloo Recreation Complex is right nearby, a major local park, the local grocery stores, everything is right there. One problem they had is across the street, it's primarily single detached neighborhood. And you know, right from the beginning of any discussion about the development of the Canbar site, it was how do we keep it as small as possible? The very first proposal came in as 53 single detached units, which would have been just a crime. And we basically stood up and pushed back and said, you know, we're looking at potential LRT along a corridor that runs right nearby here. There's no way. And the city of Waterloo, full credit, went off and did a study called the height and density study and came back and proposed a density of 400 on the land. And in fact, the developer took them up on that. There was huge attendance at the public meeting. Dozens spoke out opposing it. It was a bit of a bloodbath. And it was a sort of much upheaval in the community. And I know because I live in that community directly across the street. And what happens? The developer goes away. And this is what happens a lot, especially in smaller towns. You just see the developer pack up their proposal and leave if there's too much opposition. The second proposal, surprisingly, was for over 900 units. There was only moderate attendance at the public meeting. One person spoke against it. And in fact, there was a clustering of some of the neighbors and the developers at one point after the meeting where suggestions were made about how they could improve things, including increasing the density. And ultimately, the development was approved for 1,200 units without any appeals. Oops, sorry. So what happened in between those? What happened was we started into the development of the regional growth management strategy, and there was extensive public participation. And people became informed about the costs and benefits of growth and how it potentially affected them. And it was fascinating to watch the public meetings change after that start, or after this process. The other thing that happened was a development on the west side of Waterloo called Vista Hills. And Vista Hills proposed about 1,300 units. It's roughly 25 times the size of the Barrel Yard site, and it's located adjacent to environmental areas and on the edge of the regional recharge area that provides 80% of all the water supply for the region of Waterloo. And we were in a situation where the public was not happy about this plan of subdivision. And we had, in fact, this tug and pull going on between intensification and greenfield, like everybody does. Nobody likes either of them. In the end, what we discovered was that they didn't like greenfield development more. This is the Canbar site today. It's known as the Barrel Yards. What you see here represents about 70% of the development that actually exists today on the site, and there's still another couple towers to go. It's a great development. It's right on, literally right on the LRT line. It serves a wonderful function and would have been such a loss if we had packed up and gone home when people complained at 400. You have to learn to fight through those things. And the best way to fight through them is education. And you know, some of the key principles to bring the public on board is it takes time. It's not fast. It's not a quick process. And so it's got
Zoom, what happened here?
Sorry, we just lost Kevin. Not sure what's going on there.
Presenter just dropped off.
Yeah, can everybody, if you can hear me, just say that, put something in the chat. Okay, yep. Sorry.
Hey, babe.
Yeah, I know that Kevin's reception for whatever reason wasn't very good. Kevin, you're back. Kevin Eby, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, Kevin, we lost you about a minute ago. For whatever reason.
It's a meeting about sustainable growth. It's
yeah. May I suggest, Kevin, your bandwidth is not working properly today. Is it possible for you to turn off your camera? And this way you're using a bit less bandwidth, and what matters is that we can hear you and we can see the presentation. So maybe just try that for a moment to see what happens, because you were fading in and out. Okay, so why don't you continue then, Kevin?
My apologies, and I can assure you that everything I said that you didn't hear was brilliant. You know, so anyway, you know, I think the key thing, and just starting back at the key principles, recognize it takes time. It is not an easy process. It's really important that you get out in front of these things. If you have big projects that are coming forward, you need to be out there talking to the public early. You need to clearly identify the full range of public benefits of intensification and the broader mixes of housing form that come with them. You need to be able to speak to how it potentially benefits individuals directly. And this is so key. So many people look at it as a building's going in across the street or a building's going in down the block, and it's just a hindrance to my life. It's got nothing to do with me. And they don't really realize that that actually may be the potential location where they decide to move to, when in fact they're no longer able to live in their single detached unit, but want to stay in the neighborhood. You've got to speak to people about the fact that delivering these types of units are more affordable than typical single out in the greenfield areas. And this is an opportunity to in fact allow for these to be developed. It may be your children that end up living in these in the interim. Make it easy. You've got to go to them. You've got to get out and be in the public, be where they are, and talk to them about it. Walking through neighborhoods with the public is really an amazing way to deliver the message. Another thing, Kevin Thomason, who's on the call here today, I was talking to him the other day, and he attended as part of our regional plan review, which implemented the RGMS. He attended over 45 public sessions that we held. And I think I did about 200 presentations. The running joke was find us 3 people in a kitchen table and we'd be there. And you really need to do that. You also need to produce easy to understand educational materials. And that's really critical. People have no idea what a density looks like. You know, if I talk 50, they have no clue. If I'm talking, you know, high density development, what is that? What is medium density development? There's got to be ways to educate them easily with educational materials. And we did some really good ones at the Region of Waterloo, and I'll post copies of them, or I'll provide Franz with copies of them so that you can take a look at them. Another thing that's really critical is be first out with key information about the project. There's nothing, absolutely nothing worse than somebody learns about something that may be happening and puts out information that is incorrect to the neighborhood. And you will spend the next 2 years trying to correct information that just is not true. The first thing people hear is just so difficult to change their perceptions of it. And then the major thing in all of this is talk and listen and talk and listen and talk and listen. It's amazing how much wisdom you can get out of the community. and how much buy-in the community will give to what you're doing if in fact they truly feel like they've been heard. And examples of some of the materials we produced a blueprint for shape and growth in Waterloo, which basically took the growth plan and some of our policies and put them into visual terms and explained in relatively simple terms what they meant. We also did, and this was a really important one, visualizing densities. And what it really was meant to do is to provide examples such as, here's a subdivision, Alpine and Kitchener, it meets a 43 density. And it's got a broad range and mix of uses. You can also meet a 43 density with almost 100% singles. But if you're going, if you're adding in multiples, you can start to introduce parks, etc. It also provides visually the reality that you've got a lot more opportunity to intensify. And so our visualizing density showed densities at all levels throughout the community. Another example is downtown Kitchener. Taking a look at that density in the area here of 238. When we were talking the growth plan requirements, we were talking 200 as the core urban core areas. And so this allowed people to start to understand what we were talking about when people talk about 200 density. And then we took it the next step and we did future possibilities. How do you take sites like this in Uptown Waterloo and start to turn it into the type of densities that we're looking for and provide options? And we did a lot of work around rendering such as this to show people it doesn't have to be a massive scale to achieve what it is that we need to achieve in the densities. And we did these for the core areas in Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, and a number of sites throughout the region. And they really helped people to better understand. The second example I'm going to give you, I've got no visuals on it. I just want to talk through it. And when I started doing a number of presentations across the province, I was asked to attend a lot of conferences. And there was a gentleman named Frank Giannoni from Fram Developments who turned into one of my partners. We seem to be going back to back on a regular basis. And Frank told a regular story that I think really resonated with me. And that was, he would, with his company, they would go and find sites that were, really good sites for middle, the type of missing middle that we all need in our communities. They would purchase the property. They would proceed through the planning applications. They would end up being appealed to the board, inevitably. They would go to the board. They would inevitably win against appellants who were typically in their late 50s and early 60s, because it's typically, those are the people who have both the time and the money to fight. And what would happen was, Frank would say, we'd win the hearing, we'd set up a model home, and guess who'd be the first people in the door? The people who had fought through the hearings with them. Because as they were going through there and the evidence was presented that in fact, this was a community benefit. This was a place for someone who no longer can afford or for health reasons wants to continue to live in their single detached unit, or just lifestyle choice, wants something different, but wants to stay in the neighborhood, that these are the types of developments that facilitate that happening. And that really, it really resonates that it took an Ontario Municipal Board hearing for people to understand that in fact, these types of developments can actually be a huge benefit as opposed to a huge negative to a community. And so when you look at specific developments instead of kind of broad community ones, again, you need to get into the neighborhoods that you're trying to intensify and create a context for that before the applications appear. You need to work with the public to determine both what is needed and where it should go. Getting buy-in is absolutely essential if you're not going to end up in a world where you're in constant fight mode. I've seen communities that have done this, and what happens is the processing of the applications becomes much more streamlined. You can move through the system an awful lot better because the neighborhood understands the rules. They understand why the decisions were made, and they know that, in fact, at the end of the day, you'll work with the developer to make sure it's something that falls within the realm of what was considered appropriate as you went through the process. Again, you need to identify the public benefits, and again, be prepared to speak to the benefits to them personally. This is a potential place for them to age in. It's a potential place for their parents to age in if they have to look after them, but they can't necessarily live in the home. It's in the community, it's nearby. Again, same things, make it easy for them. Talk, listen, talk, listen, talk, listen. You've got to engage people. They've got to feel pulled into the process. And as you do that, it's really, really important to establish and maintain trust with the community. Having the same person do it, with the same community groups is really, really critical. And if you can keep them on over, 5, 6, 8, 9 year period of time to help the community through the initial stages, that's even better. Another thing is, once made decisions on heights and densities, you really, really have to try and hold them at that. Developers will come in and ask for 5 more stories or 10 more stories. And every time you go with that, you start to break the trust with the community who's worked through it with you to come to a conclusion. You also need to foster community champions. And that's why Kevin Thomason is here. I've asked him to speak a little bit about this, because quite frankly, there are times when community members will listen to community members more than they'll listen to us. And to have somebody come from the community to speak to the benefits is so important. And the rest, are the same as the other. You need easily to understand visual examples of the form, scale, and density of developments. We're right now in Waterloo having extensive discussion about how do we start to intensify the small communities, the Elmira, St. Jacobs, Wellesley, Ayr, New Hamburg, and Baden. These are communities that don't have 60,000 people in them, and yet they also need to intensify. And for them, intensification is going to be a way to start to deliver seniors housing that is needed in mass, given the aging population. And where many of these smaller communities have, a high 80% single detached units, there are no seniors age appropriate housing for people to move into, especially not in the numbers they're going to need. And again, you need to talk and listen and talk and listen. This is so critical. I can't emphasize it enough. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin, and hopefully my bandwidth improves. So, Kevin.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you, Kevin. And I want to talk and totally agree with everything you say. And I think there's 3 examples in our community that really resonates of ways we've helped move from NIMBY to YIMBY. And I think so much it comes down to that need for education and understanding. And often it really just works down to change management. Because there's a real fear of change, and people need to understand that transformation and innovation, and that I think that there's the need to have people participate. There's the need for them to have a chance to learn, and also have a chance to be heard. And sometimes that's heard to officials. Sometimes that's just commiserate with their neighbors and within their peer groups and such. But within our community here, there's been three different things that I think have been really watershed moments or key moments in breaking through at times between NIMBY and YIMBY. And one of those community group that was created called Hold the Line. And this is a community group that was created to promote a planning concept. And it was actually a really kind of a weird one because it didn't come out of kind of the standard environmentalist group or whatever. It actually came from a group of music enthusiasts who were also a little bit back to earth and picture your Woodstock hippies and that sort of thing. And they said, there's a need to educate people on this new permanent urban boundary concept that's been going around our community. And we need people to understand what it is because this is going to be really important to our future. And our countryside line concept here in Waterloo Region isn't just a city limit that goes around our cities. It goes around every little village, every hamlet, everywhere, and it is their permanent growth boundary. And so to create a group around a permanent boundary sounded kind of strange, but what this group does is celebrates this boundary. And so what they do is they have a giant music festival every year, and they purposely hold that music festival out on a farm right on that countryside line. So picture Woodstock, just like in the 1960s or whatever. You've got a stage, you've got a band, you've got all these local musicians being profiled and local talent. You're promoting a local farm and farmer. You've got people coming out and camping for the weekend, and it is just an incredible opportunity for the community to come together. But that's not just what they do. They also say, well, we can't just talk to the music community. How do we engage others? So they reached out to the cycling community and the sports community, and they organize a series of cycling rides around the countryside line. There's a 5-kilometer route, a 10-kilometer route, a 25-kilometer route, and for those really ambitious, an 80-kilometer route where you go all the way around Kitchener and Waterloo, right along the countryside line. And what a better way to show people the countryside, the farms and the natural areas and things like that you're protecting firsthand than by getting them out and involved and engaged and bringing together with people of like minds. They also work very proactively with our elected officials. So right now, as we're gearing up to municipal elections and candidates are starting to declare, the Hold the Line folks are already out talking to those candidates as they declare, asking them, literally giving them a questionnaire and making them sign a pledge. Do you pledge to uphold the countryside line in your time as the councillor? And it was actually quite interesting to be at a City of Kitchener meeting yesterday where they were one of the delegations presenting, and they literally brought up on the screen the list from 2018 of the councillors who were in that meeting who pledged to uphold the countryside line. And it was a great way to literally hold feet to the fire or to ensure that the elected officials were living up to the commitments they'd made to our community. So the Hold the Line group is a really neat one that has really done a great job of involving and engaging the public and what would rather be an obscure planning concept. Another one is a group called Smart Growth Waterloo Region. And this was a group that was formed back in 2012 when our region got into a very challenging battle at the OMB with our regional official plan that had actually been approved by the region 2 or 3 years earlier in 2009, but then got appealed every single word of it by a large group of developers and then got bogged down at the OMB, a divisional court and all kinds of things. But there was a challenge in the fact that our community needed to know about this really important battle, but it was really, I won't call it mundane, but complex planning concepts that needed somebody to translate it and put it into the jargon that would be understood with the local citizens and have them understand why is the region spending millions of dollars to try to defend this and what are the implications. And Smart Growth Waterloo Region, amazingly, to this day, still has a mailing list of over 500 citizens who say, yes, I want to be kept up to date on these planning issues. I want to know. And it is amazing that as issues come up, these people are still willing now, we're, I guess, 7 years past that official plan being approved, but the numbers of those people who will still speak up now to defend aspects of that plan, or now as we're getting engaged in the next version of the ROP or whatever, but it's been absolutely fantastic just to see the community interest. And then again, what would have been a somewhat obscure legal battle playing out in some distant courtroom instead became something right involved in the community. The third example I'll bring up is our environmentally sensitive landscapes. And this I'll talk to the comment that Kevin Eby made about misinformation. And I called this a little bit the monster under your bed. And when you were a kid, you had no fear of getting out of bed and getting up in the morning or whatever, until one day at school, one of your friends told you there was a monster that lived under your bed. And from that day on, you were always afraid to put your feet out on the floor because the monster would reach out and grab your feet. And then the number of grown adults that I know to this day who still are afraid to put their feet at the end of the bed and kind of leap out of bed so the monster doesn't get them, even though as an adult, you know there is no such thing as a monster living under your bed. That idea or that concept has been so implanted and ingrained. And unfortunately, what we saw with the ESLs, our environmentally sensitive landscapes, which is kind of, I'll call it a mini version of a green belt where we were protecting an entire watershed. It was happening at a time where there was a lot of other government rules coming in. There were no pesticides and bylaws coming through and a bunch of other things. And unfortunately, the opponents to this ESL got out with a lot of misinformation in the community. They got out with the fact that the government was coming to take your land. They're going to tell you what to do. You wouldn't be, it was also when there was a bunch of no smoking bylaws coming through. So, it got out there that you wouldn't even be allowed to smoke on your land. You wouldn't be able to use fertilizers. You wouldn't be able to use pesticides. You wouldn't be able to do anything the way you did. And it took a long time. It took months and months and months to try to convince people that no, the government wasn't coming for their land. Yes, you'd still always be able to farm the way you have been. And it was a real broad community effort to try to get to the 602 landowners who were in this area and get that proper information out. And I think that's one of the key things with the NIMBY to YIMBY is we can't underestimate the need to be proactive and get out there with the positive message and the positive information before somebody gets this concept that there's a monster under your bed that you're never going to be able to get out of your head the rest of your life, despite the logic that there is really nothing living under your bed. And so, I think that's something what we've worked hard, and the Grand River Environmental Network that I'm vice chair of, we spend an awful lot of time just trying to do that community outreach, that engagement, that involvement in education, or what in the business world they'd call change management, just so people have an understanding of some of these changes and some of these things that are going to be coming, usually in a good way. And frankly, with climate change and the need we're going to have half our carbon emissions by 2030 or even more by 2050, there's going to be a ton of change coming, and this is something we're going to have to get very good at. So I'll turn it back to you, Kevin, but those are 3 examples from our community here that hopefully provide some insights.
And just to quickly wrap up, and I think there's probably more value in question and answer than there is in listening to us speak. But I think really what we learned in Waterloo was to engage the public, engage them early, give them as much information as we possibly could, get to know them. And in fact, what the 2 organizations, plus actually almost a third one with the ESLs that Kevin's talked about, they become allies. We have the farm groups. The most effective person who's come and spoken to us about intensification and LRT, in fact, is the head of the Waterloo Federation of Agriculture, because he knows and they know that the way to stop the line from continuing to move out is in fact to start to intensify downtown. And when we took those first steps, they were some of the most important people to deliver on, like to come to meetings, to talk to the public, to talk to the politicians and make sure that message is clear. And just to give you a sense of what we accomplished in Waterloo, we've averaged 59.5% intensification over the last 10 years and 64% intensification over the last 5. So we're doing some things right. We've got a lot of buy-in, and on that, France, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin Eby and Kevin Thomason. Now it's over to the rest of you. We've had a couple of questions and comments in the chat function. And so I'm going to invite you to use the chat function to either say, hey, I have a question, or if you want to, just put the question in the chat function and I will read it out loud. If you want to ask it, just unmute yourself when I call your name. We did have one question from Councillor Cheryl, and I apologize if I'm going to get this your name pronounced incorrectly, Gordich. And she asked, and I think you kind of answered this already, Kevin Eby, when do you start the process for public engagement? Maybe you can just reiterate the importance of what you just said.
Yesterday. I mean, it literally is. The sooner you get out there, and it's funny, the public is not nearly as receptive to a fully baked, proposal coming to them. They know, they're smart. They know that if you come to them with everything, that the chances of it changing are almost zero. You're a lot better off to get out there and talk to them about the principles that you're trying to deliver, and then build the product, whether it's a specific, developments, or a development scheme within a neighborhood, or whether it's really big picture things. You're so much better to get out early and talk to them. And the one thing, we benefit hugely here because we have 2 universities and a community college. It's amazing just how many people we get that if they're given the opportunity, they jump right in. They absolutely will jump in. And so yesterday would be my answer.
Okay, and I think the councillor has a follow-up question.
Yes, thank you. I guess what I was trying to say is that because of being, this is my first term, and sometimes the projects have started. So I guess maybe perhaps this is more of a process because of what you used to do, Mr. Eby, is we have a development that's coming to council, but we know the lands were sold maybe about 15 years ago. And the developer, I guess, is, for whatever reason, is just sort of bringing the application. Is it more of a process that when you were a planner, that it was a more proactive from your staffing? Because the first time we're sort of seeing it as a council is kind of like Monday night. And so is there a process that is done sort of with the staff to be more engaged? And I'm kind of wondering if you could speak to maybe how when you were on planning, how you did that, because to me, it is too late come Monday night for us to have a public engagement. I mean, I know notices went around for people to know about it, but I don't know what else goes on behind the scenes. That's kind of where I was coming from.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of success is, and I'll speak to the three cities as examples. When you have a large enough area that you can get in and start to do community planning early, and spend the time, in a lot of cases, it's done when there really are virtually no residents there. And they do it so early, it's greenfield land. But what we're saying now, and certainly with the subdivisions that you're talking about, it's really working with the interface with the existing community that is really important, but also working with the existing community to determine what are the types of units that in fact you need. What is the demand? Are you trying to accommodate the growth within your community, which may be a huge, in your community, a huge need for seniors housing? Or are you just simply providing more greenfield housing for commuters that are coming from far, work far away, and have come looking for what they see as a cheaper house than they would get in Milton or even Cambridge or Kitchener? And so it's you've got to go very early, as early as you can. But where it gets really, and this is in your community, where it gets really tricky is when you start to talk about intensification, because you're not then trying to do community planning on a vacant piece of land. You're trying to do community planning in an area that a couple thousand people live. And you have to get in and engage them. You've got to get in and talk to them. It's their community. And if given the proper information, they'll make good decisions if they understand what the benefits are to them of some of the changes. It's not just change to be avoided. And, Kevin's dead on. This is change management that we're into now. The days of big greenfield developments are soon going to be over. We're going to need to be pushing inwards. And that's where, the community consultation, it should start now everywhere in New Hamburg and Baden. That should be the next thing that happens.
Okay, we have another question from Shirley Kevin. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate this conversation. I'm happy to be part of it. I'm deputy mayor here in my community, small community on Georgian Bay, less than 12,000 people. And we do try to engage our public. We do, and we have huge turnout at our public meetings, but they are very much negative. We have a large group in our community that are organized. They are educated young retirees who have chosen to come and live in our community, but now they do not want the community to change. And they will fight against every single development that is proposed. We're one of the last areas on Georgian Bay to develop, and people do not want that to happen. No matter how we try to share what the benefits could be, they just don't want the change. And they always talk about the traffic and the noise and all the usual potential side effects of growth, and just are not willing to hear the benefits. So how do we get past that? How do we get through to these folks who are, retired engineers and lawyers and as I say, well-heeled folks who have chosen this community and want it to continue to be a very quiet, rural, heritage-respecting community? How do we reach them?
I was at a council meeting a couple nights ago where one of the councilors said it best. He said that, yeah, it seems that everybody moves in is really happy to be here as long as they're the last person who gets to move here. And it's a fascinating, problem. It's funny, what we see a lot in planning is that we get stuck in the notion that there's only one way to approach the people. And we keep trying to do, the open house over and over and over again, or the public meeting over and over and over again. And there are so many other ways to engage the community, and things like workshops. Urban Strategies did some wonderful workshops for us when we were doing some of our work in the region, where they sat people down and you pose a problem, and you engage them in, how am I going to solve this? What you've got to have a legitimate problem, and you've got smart people in your community. These are people that can come up with solutions. Don't go to them with the solution. Go to them with the problem, and really try and create a clean slate and say, here's what we're going to do. It could be you're short on assessment, you need additional assessment, which is what's driving your growth. It could be, my goodness, we're facing, challenges with commercial areas that just don't have enough, business to continue to operate, that we're going to lose amenities, or, we need new amenities that come with a little more growth that we just can't get. There's all kinds of, there's all kinds of different ways, but it's interesting planning. What's the old saying? Trying the exact same, insanity is defined as in trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Well, if the way you're doing it isn't working, there are other ways, and talk to some really experienced planners. It's worth a little bit of money to sit down with them and ask them, what are the alternatives? Because there are alternatives. I've seen so many different ways that people engage the public, and breaking the mold is tough for planners who've done it the same way over and over again. You start to fall into the trap that you think that's the only way to do it, and it's not. So my advice would be, look for different avenues, look at different ways to challenge the public, look for champions within, and really get them to start to engage the other people. So there's some suggestions at least. And the one thing I have found, workshops where a problem is posed, where you give everybody a pen and you say, forget I'm a planner, I don't know anything. How would you solve it? And it's amazing the ideas that will come to the table. And it's also amazing the buy-in you'll get from people who participate in those types of programs. You know, and just to build one last thing, throw down a map and say, we need housing for seniors. Where are we going to put them? Give me some, don't say, you're not allowed to say there isn't any room. Can't do that. Where can we put them? So you decide. And,
Yeah.
you know, that type of activity really does start to buy, well, it does two things. One is it shows how difficult it is and that maybe some of their criticisms are unwarranted, but it also starts to really get people thinking about what's going on. And what you may trigger is somebody who goes, you know what? I was down in Colorado last week or 6 weeks ago, and I saw this. This would fit. This is a good idea. And that's the type of stuff we've got to generate more and more. And a lot of that comes from the members of the community that are out there seeing things that we as politicians and staff don't necessarily get to see all the time.
Yeah, excellent answer, Kevin. And if I can just add something that happened recently in our community here that was quite insightful, and it actually didn't come from one of our planning groups. It came out of Sustainable Waterloo, which is actually one of our climate change groups. And they ran what was called a backcasting workshop. And I thought this is kind of interesting. I don't know what backcasting is, but they invited a core group of people from the community. There were elected officials, business leaders, but then even just the head librarian and school teachers and people you wouldn't really expect. It was a broad assortment. They put the 50 of us in the room with the challenge of tell us what our ideal community looks like in 2050. And by 2050, we will have cut our carbon emissions by 80%. What does a sustainable community look like? And so we were broken into groups, and we figured, well, we'd all be driving electric cars. We would have walkable, complete communities, and our jobs would be close by, and all those sort of things we envision in the future. But then the interesting thing of the backcasting was they said, okay, if that's 2050, what does it look like in 2040? And if you wanted 100% electric cars in 2050, in 2040, how many electric cars do you have? And then they had to do, what does it look like in 2030? And what does it look like in 2025? And suddenly we realized, okay, if we wanted to get there, if we wanted to move our community to this utopia, here were the ways and the steps to achieve that. And it was really powerful. And you could see the impact it was having on everyone in the room, because frankly, we spend very little time ever thinking about the long-term vision for our community and what we want to be. We just kind of randomly stumble forward into the future there. And so this was a really powerful exercise that, and I'm sure if you Google backcasting, I'm sure there's all kinds of information available on it.
Okay, we have a question from Joy Sims in the chat. I'm just going to paraphrase. Consultations typically have a very narrow set of attendees and their demographics. What are your tips for reminding attendees that we need to consider the voices that may not be in the room? For example, people from lower incomes, marginalized folks, recent immigrants, young people. How do you get them? How do you make sure that those voices have a seat at the table if they're not literally there?
Absolutely, you have to get out in the community, and that's, anybody who's depending on a public meeting in a regional or a local municipal facility as the way to get their information really is missing the boat to a great extent. Especially the marginalized communities, you have to go out and talk to them. You've got to find ways to interact with them, and it may not be in a formal public meeting setting. It might be walking down the street and engaging in conversation. Some of the most enlightening, revelations that I've had aren't sitting in a meeting room. They're sitting in a coffee shop with people and talking. That's where they're comfortable talking. And another thing that we did during the regional plan back in review back in 2005 through 2009 was we organized with the local municipalities a whole bunch of walking tours. And, literally, I walked kilometers after kilometers, day after day. But what you got was you got people looking at their community in a different way. And that was another way to attract people who otherwise would not come. I thought the question was going, well, and the question was somewhat, there's nothing worse as a planner and as council than you have a really, really good proposal and 10 people show up and everybody is against it. And yet, out in the community, there's tons of support for it. And yet when you as a councillor vote for that project and every single person who's been there as a delegation against it, they just cannot understand why that is. And that's where I've seen interesting ones in different places. I saw a video the other day of an interview with somebody from a marginalized community where somebody went out with a camera and a microphone and just sat and talked to them and got them to give their really honest feelings about what it was. And in that case, it was housing, affordable housing, and how do we get to it? And those are powerful. You got to be honest. You can't cherry pick your candidates to do that. But if you can get people to do that, and if you can play it for members, at a council meeting and other places, it starts to level the playing field from a thinking standpoint. But otherwise, you've got to find a way. You've got to get into those groups, because the people who actually come to formal public meetings are just, they're a little bubble onto themselves in most cases. If you don't find other ways to engage your community, you're going to get a pretty singular voice, or you may get two voices who counter each other. But, again, it's find different ways, get out, find a way to, 6 people around a table and talk. And if you get 6 people around a table and have honest conversation, you're getting probably way more out of that as to really understanding the community, its needs, and its willingness to go places than you will in 10 public meetings.
Yeah. And if I could just make a quick comment there, just based on recent experiences with our regional official plan, by a bit of a fluke, I did a presentation, I'll call it, to a more traditional environmental group crowd. But there's somebody there who said, this might be of interest to my church group. Would you mind coming to do our every Wednesdays, our church gets together, all the seniors, our church seniors club. And, I think they might be interested in it because an official plan impacts everyone in our city. And it was interesting, by presenting to that one church group, I've now been invited to about 6 other church groups, which then actually led to an invitation to a basic income group, because even the basic income group realized they needed to get out and advocate for the affordable housing that they need. And it's just been incredible to see how that one seed planted has led down a path to a whole bunch of groups and audiences that we would not normally interact with, but it's been absolutely fantastic. And if I can also comment on the corollary of that, as much as there's a need to engage the public in things, something I've learned as a bit of an activist or involved in the community, there's just as much need to ensure that our counselors and staff are involved in things. And we realized quite early during a presentation when we came once to a city council to talk about an area, you could tell by the blank faces around the horseshoe, none of them had a clue where we were talking about and had probably never been to the area. You can't assume that your mayor's been to every part of your city. So that began what we call our Moraine 101 tours. And I have probably given 150 Moraine 101 tours since then, where it's a very simple premise. I say, give me a couple hours of your time and I will give you an afternoon that you'll remember the rest of your life. And we take these people out and just amaze them and delight them, to see what's happening in their own city and parts of their own city that they can't believe. They've got their cameras out saying, I never thought we had places like this in our city. So I don't think we can underestimate the potential for even just a simple walk in the woods.
Yeah, and that applies, just a really quick add on to that. That applies as much to the urban area as it does to the environmental areas. The number of people who don't know some of the really, really cool things that are happening within the community from an urban design standpoint, et cetera, getting them out there and actually, get out of the public meeting and get out into the streets. That's how you win the day.
So thanks for those responses. If I guess I'm a planner, but I myself would also fall under multiple of the categories of the people who typically don't get to participate in these types of processes. And yeah, I guess my question was also just related to, everybody's trying to improve their consultations and get out in all of those different varied ways that you both suggested, which are great. But I think kind of an issue that comes down to it is at those public meetings, I think whether it's initial one or when you're actually bringing final reports and recommendations to your council, people still remember who's physically there or on Zoom or what have you, a lot more than they do the people who aren't there and aren't speaking. So just kind of always trying to wrap my head around how can we, bring again the people who aren't there to the forefront, whether it's kind of backing things up with facts, because ultimately what's on the public record is who's at the public meeting and who submitted written comments. So that's kind of where my question's coming from, and thinking about how to strengthen the needs, representing the needs of marginalized communities.
And if somebody has the guts to actually do it, is challenge your staff to go out and talk to them and write it up and put it in the report and list the groups that you won't consider anything until you've heard from these groups in some shape or form. It would take guts to do, and it takes dedication of resources. But if you want to get a wide-ranging consultation, demand it. And as counselors, you can do that. It would be an interesting exercise. But what it would do, and this is, I think, what Kevin was talking about, is it starts to open doors into those marginalized groups. And it starts to open doors into places that the planners never go. And it really is, we're working for them, and yet we never talk to them. And it's really unfortunate, but something like that, where a requirement for certain types of planning reports is, you got to go out and talk to some church groups. You've got to go out and talk to as part of it. I don't just want an ad in the paper in a public meeting here that's going to be 12 minutes long because there'll be one delegation or 3 delegations from exactly the same group. I want to understand a broader range of perspectives out there on some of the key issues. Go get it. That'd be a heck of a challenge. And yeah, it makes total sense to do it. And the first time will be really tough. Second time will be a lot easier because you'll open doors into those groups by doing that.
Okay, we're at the top of the hour at 5 o'clock, and I'm going to wrap it up. I know there's another question from Councillor Gordich. Perhaps, Councillor, you could just send that to me, and I'll make sure that that Kevin Eby answers it. Before we sign off, I want to thank Kevin for his very thoughtful presentation and remarks, and also Kevin Thomason. I'd like to invite you to visit the OGA website, greenbeltalliance.ca, where you can find a variety of resources about planning in a Greenbelt friendly way. We have stuff on there from the last set of webinars. We'll have more over the next few weeks. As well, please contact me if you have any follow-up questions for Kevin Eby. And for those of you who have joined us for the first time, we hope that today is the beginning of an ongoing dialogue which will help lead us towards a future where your local needs are met in a way that also helps the Greenbelt. I hope to see many of you on Tuesday at our next webinar. It's called Off the Shelf Tools, Greenbelt Development Standards. And it's going to be our tour guide, as it were, will be Gabriela Kalopos from Clean Air Partnership, who's an expert on green development standards. If you haven't signed up for that yet, just go to the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance website, follow the links to these webinar series, and you can sign up there. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.